And now James O'Shea, former managing editor at the Chicago Tribune and editor-in-chief of the Los Angeles Times, takes an inside look at the acquisition of the Times-Mirror Company by the Tribune Company and the later acquisition of the Tribune Company by investor Sam Zell. This is about an hour, 10 minutes.
Hello. Hi, and welcome, and I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'm Leslie Hindman, and it is my great pleasure to introduce these two wonderful gentlemen, Jim O'Shea and Jim Warren. It's such a fun group, and so many people are close friends of theirs that it's nice to have both of them here together. Jim O'Shea is a very good friend of mine, and so it's especially fun for me to host this. I'm a member of his board, the CNC board, and it's wonderful to see what they're doing. What I'm more excited about tonight is that I'm sort of doing a favor to Jim O'Shea by doing this, and something you may not know about him is that Jim O'Shea is a master electrician. He put himself through college, I don't know if you know this or not, by doing electrical work, and so we have a lot of work that needs to be done around here. And I was hoping, Jim, that you would stick around afterward and maybe fix some of the lights and things like that. Obviously, you all know Jim Warren. He is a real hellraiser and a fabulous human being. Jim is a former managing editor of the Chicago Tribune, and he now writes a column for the Chicago News Cooperative, which obviously appears twice a week in the New York Times and also on CNC's website. Jim Warren is a fixture in journalism. You're all aware of that. He's known all over the country and indeed all over the world for his frequent appearances on shows like The McLaughlin Group and Capital Gang on CNN. He was the Washington bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune. He writes for everyone, including the Atlantic Monthly. He was a blogger for the Huffington Post. He once worked for the Sun-Times even. And he's basically done pretty much everything. These two guys, I'm sure most of you know, have worked together for years. And we've heard a lot of different stories about them working together. One of my favorite stories is a story that both of them kind of tell about how Jim O'Shea was so mad at Jim Warren that he screamed at him and hung up the phone, and then they didn't speak for quite a while. Do you guys remember that? You never forget it. And we're all hoping that Jim Warren isn't here to retaliate tonight. So. I know that Jim Warren will be giving you a lot of Jim O'Shea's background. Everybody's named Jim, basically. But I just wanted to say quickly that I have huge respect, and I know many of you do, for Jim O'Shea. It is amazing to me all that he's accomplished in his life. And you know that he was a very much loved journalist and managing editor of the Tribune. And everyone feels very deeply about, him in general. And chatting with people tonight, it's nice to see how much people really love him and care about him and respect him. And so I'm very honored that you guys are here. I think it took a lot of courage to write this book. Jim is used to more writing about other people, and to write about himself, I think, is not always so easy. And so it's really especially great to have him here talking about his life and his book. I also want to mention that this is being taped for C-SPAN. I think you know that. And C-SPAN has asked me to ask you, if you're asking questions during question and answer time, please wait until the mic comes over to you before you start asking your question. So with all of that, I'd like to introduce Jim and Jim.
Well, thank you, everybody. I am Jim Warren, with my colleague, friend, and former boss, Jim O'Shea, former editor of the Los Angeles Times, former managing editor of the Chicago Tribune, and want to thank Leslie Hindman for offering this space, which I hadn't realized until about an hour ago is a very appropriate space given the topic of the book, an auction house, since the book revolves very much around two deals, one clearly an auction. What you may assume is that given our relationship, the fix is in here. This is going to be 45 minutes or an hour of mutually agreeable score settling, and there are a lot of scores to settle. Indeed, the fact is that if the FBI had wiretapped our conversations in the same way they had wiretapped those of a hapless former Illinois governor, you would find no shortage of creative tension between us for periods of time. And as one late former colleague of ours, former foreign editor of the paper, once put it, evidence of Jim O'Shea's Celtic rage, which I occasionally was the target of. I'll be very, very short. The most interesting thing in this book about Jim O'Shea personally refers to his being a St. Louis native and a graduate of a military high school run by the Christian Brothers, where he writes, quote, "The only thing I really learned was how to take a punch." The man before you finished third lowest in his class, and his older sister suspected that he was destined for a career in newspapers when at age 9 he stole her diary and sold it to her boyfriend for $5. So at the point tonight that you just begin to start taking him seriously, just remember that. So let's start off, and just a housekeeping thing. There are a whole bunch of seats here, maybe 8, 9, 10 seats in the front if folks want to very subtly come on down and sit for a while rather than stand. So, Jim, all these many years later since we met, we have this book called A Deal from Hell. What's it about, basically, and why should we care? Especially, why should people watching us far away in Bangor, Maine, Portland, Maine, Utica, New York, wherever, why should they care?
Well, I mean, really, this book talks a lot about the differences between journalism today and journalism when I started. When I got into the journalism, the newspaper business was really largely controlled by families. Not all of them were angels by any means, but they really had a kind of a public service mantra that they followed, and it basically was, no one could ever have put it better than Mike Coles, who was a leading member of the family that owned the first newspaper I worked for, the Des Moines Register. And Mike always said the only thing a newspaper really has to worry about is that the public respects it. Because if the public respects it, you will have readers, and if you have readers, you will have advertisers, and that's the main source of income and revenue for newspapers. So you really have to be respected by the public to be in a successful business. And then around the 1960s and the 70s, that sort of got turned on its head when the families wanted to get out of the business and they started selling off their newspapers. And a lot of times they sold them to people who, to corporations that were owned by stockholders, and the people that ran those corporations had a duty to journalists and to journalism, but they also had a fiduciary duty to stockholders. And as first things were fine because we all had a lot of money rolling in, and it was pretty easy to balance those two things. But then, in sometime after September 11th, that changed, and we began struggling with revenues. And as we tried to maintain the profit margins, which were considerable, we began cutting and we began diminishing our journalism. And I suspect all of us were a little bit guilty of subordinating the public, the interest of the public, to our fiduciary duties to produce the kind of returns that Wall Street and others expected. And I really think that that kind of led us down this path to where we are today. And in the case of the Tribune Company, it led them to bankruptcy court, and a great institution that was a fixture in here is today an institution in trouble. And I think it has, it's an institution that has, and all newspapers like it, I don't think people understand the fundamental role that newspapers play in giving voters and people in a democracy the information and news they need. And they're under threat today, and I think it's a really troubling, it's troubling to me, it's troubling to a lot of people, and I think so everybody, I think, should care about this story, not just because it's about me, or not because it's about the Chicago Tribune or the LA Times, but it's about journalism, and that's something that I think is vital to a democratic society.
Though this book is called The Deal from Hell, it's really about two deals. The first comes in the year 2000 and involves the purchase by Tribune Company, venerable Chicago-based owner of several dozen very respected television stations and newspapers, its purchase of Los Angeles-based Times Mirror Company. Give us succinctly sort of the economic backdrop at the time, the newspaper industry backdrop, and the rationale for that first of the two big deals. And if you want to mention a fellow somewhere along the line who became known, I think, as the serial killer, that's not cereal like John Wayne Gacy, it's cereal like Cheerios and Smart Start, C-E-R-E-A-L. Tell us a little bit about him and why he was critical to the tactics and strategy in executing this deal.
Well, I think the deal with Sam Zell was the deal from hell, and the Tribune made a stop in purgatory first when it bought Times Mirror, and you know, basically the atmosphere at the time was buy or be bought. And everybody, AOL and Time Warner had just merged, and things were going quite well. And so when the Tribune decided to buy this, things looked pretty good. The future looked pretty bright. We paid a lot of money for it, and it was. And the way the deal was structured is we bought the company, even though Mark Willis, the serial killer, who was the CEO of Times Mirror, and by the way, he got that title. He used to be the co-chairman of General Mills, where they made all this cereal, and the staff of the LA Times was phenomenal. If the staff of the LA Times would have done as well at journalism as they did at coming up with nicknames, we wouldn't be talking about this, because they did a great job. And so they nicknamed Mark the serial killer because he came in right away, started cutting things and cutting staff. He went and closed New York Newsday, and therefore he got that name. But when the Tribune bought it, Mark Willis didn't know that the Tribune was buying the company. They bought it when he wasn't even looking. It was just kind of a nice little backstabbing drama that played out in a place where they literally made drama in Los Angeles. And I think because they were trying to really do the deal in secret, a lot of things that we should have known about, that we didn't know about, came back to haunt us later. And the company got in this, the things that we didn't know about, like a huge tax case, circulation problems at Newsday and a circulation fraud, all of these sort of things came back to haunt us and really put us into a troubled condition, which made us vulnerable to Mr. Zell.
The tax case, which Jim refers to, was one which was ultimately settled with the IRS for how much?
$1 billion.
Somewhere, or maybe a little south of that. But anyway, it was big. And also the circulation problems that Jim refers to was in the Long Island newspaper, Newsday, which were, I gather, part and parcel of the double-edged sword of trying to do the deal in secret behind the back of the CEO. Am I correct in not doing the sort of due diligence that one might have normally?
I think that's true. I mean, I think you can fault a lot of people, but the due diligence didn't last very long, and we didn't see it coming, even though there was evidence. So one of the things I found, and one of the things that really surprised me, is I found some letters that were written to people involved in the circulation scandal 6 months after the letters went to the guy who was involved in the scandal, one of the kind of guys that was making up fake computer programs, in September of 2000, which was 6 months after we completed this deal. And what was even more surprising is the lawyer responding to him was a lawyer for a law firm in Los Angeles named Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, which represented the Chandler family, who was the family that sold us the LA Times. And so I think those were sorts of things. It was, there were some signs there, and we just didn't pick up on them because we were trying to get the deal done, and we were in a situation where we didn't want to ignite a bidding war and have to pay even more for the papers, so we did it in secret. And I think part of the price of that is there was a lot of things we didn't catch.
The Chandlers, for a bunch of reasons, were unhappy with the CEO whom they picked to run their company. What was the lure of Tribune Company to the Chandlers?
Well, the Chandlers really wanted to transform the LA Times from a newspaper company to something different. They really, I don't know that they were really clear what they wanted, but they saw the Tribune come along. We had newspapers, we had television, we were early into the internet, probably one of the more innovative companies at the time. And I think they also felt very strongly that the leadership of the Tribune Company, particularly someone who's in the audience, Jack Fuller, was someone who really gave the company credibility because of his journalistic principles, and because he was considered, he had just written a book about news values and was really considered someone who they trusted. And so I think they really saw a lot of good things about the Tribune Company, and wanted to diversify, and they wanted cash. They wanted a lot of cash because they're a family that loves dividends and hates taxes, and so that was a good way to get some money, and it was a kind of a tax-free transfer.
And what did they get out of the deal? What money-wise? What were the economics?
I think it was a $7 or $8 billion deal. They got a lot of Tribune stock, and there was a dispute in the thing because the Chandlers wanted to take they wanted their money all in stock because they wouldn't have to pay taxes on it, because it was a tax-free transfer. And some of the minority shareholders didn't like that because they were going to get cash and they would have to pay taxes on it. So that it finally got settled out. But it was at that time the largest newspaper merger in history.
I apologize for my obsession with a particular former Illinois governor, but in the same way we kind of now reflexively disparage him, forgetting that there may be some in this audience who, by my count, may have voted for him 6 different times. There's also an impulse, correct, to disparage the Tribune-Times-Mirror deal now. Is it not true that for some good period of time the conventional wisdom was that it was a smart move and that things were going in the right direction?
There were a lot of times that the deal was actually working. I mean, in the early years, it was doing quite well. The Tribune Company took a lot of cost out of the Times-Mirror. There was a lot of duplication. They did something that, frankly, was almost that no one else has really been able to duplicate, and that was they started a thing called Career Builder, which was a job site, and Monster was considered the internet guru that was going to wipe out everybody, and we started Career Builder, and it's one of the few times of a legacy media company starting an internet operation that was highly successful and eventually overtook Monster. So for quite a while, it was working pretty well. And journalistically, the Los Angeles Times, when we took it over, was reeling from a scandal. And we turned that paper around, and it was winning Pulitzer Prizes right and left under the leadership. So while people were disparaging the Chicago Tribune, they were praising the editors that the Chicago Tribune put in charge of the Los Angeles Times.
Now, for sure, as the book details, there was no shortage of frictions fairly quickly between some factions in Chicago, us folks in the newsroom, and our counterparts in Los Angeles, which increasingly, it seemed to us sort of this, wayward Western empire doing what the hell it wanted to do. But let's move past all that wonderful, rich possibilities of score settling, which I just so love to do now, but I won't. I'll take the higher road. Let's fast forward to the core of the book, the second big deal, the deal from hell, and tell us what was going on in the industry, at the company, in the economy, in the period of around 2006, 2007, that prompt a de facto auction of this famous media powerhouse and brings into the spotlight a gentleman named Sam Zell.
Well, at the time, there was a lot of turmoil in the industry. There were a lot of budget cuts. Everybody was struggling with revenues. Those kind of tensions really created a lot of, because it was who's going to get it? who's going to lose staff? Is it going to be the LA Times or is it going to be the Chicago Tribune? Everybody's fighting for their reputation. Personally, I was asked to go out to the Los Angeles Times. It was in 2006, in November of 2006, after the staff had rebelled against the Tribune Company numerous times. John Carroll, one of its editors, left. A year later, Dean Baquet, a good friend of mine, left. And I went out in November of 2006 to take over the LA Times. And I'll never forget, the first day I walked in the door of the LA Times, and the security guard said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Jim O'Shea, I'm the new editor." And he said, "Oh." And he goes down and he gets a pass for me to come in the building. It was good for one day. He gave it to me. And I thought, that says a lot right there. And I walked into the newsroom, and all around the newsroom were plastered pictures of Dean Baquet and Otis Chandler, who was like the god. Otis was Zeus in the LA Times. And I kind of looked around and I thought, okay, welcome. And so I had decided that I was just going to go there and I was going to get up in front of the newsroom. I told them right away, I said, "I want you to assemble the staff." And I went out and I basically, said, "Okay, I'm a journalist. I'm here. I think I can help you guys." And I just basically tried to be real honest with them and appeal to the sense in journalists that, they'll give you a fair shake. They traffic in fairness and balance. And if they think you're honest and they think it, they'll give you a chance, even if they, can't stand you, which a lot of them probably looked at me like that. And so I basically did that, and we went to work and we tried to do it. But all throughout the industry, you have to understand, we had gone through 3-4 years of trying to figure out, the right size of the newsroom, how to downsize the newsroom. There were real economic winds blowing through the whole industry, forcing all of us to do a lot of things that we didn't like. And then that included laying off people, eliminating jobs. And it got to the point where you really didn't want to do anything because you were afraid if you stuck your head up, somebody'd say, you're going to switch somebody? Do you really need them? I mean, and so you kind of got to the point where it was, you were really sick of cutting back, and you were just looking for an opportunity to do something about it. Not a lot of people knew what to do. And that's when Sam Zell came along.
Okay, but what were the factors that prompted the Tribune Company to essentially put itself up for sale? Why? Why did it need anybody to come in? What was going on with its stock price? What was going on with revenues? Why was it not on the same steady course?
Well, the revenues started eroding. The cash flow began being challenged, we could say. I think part of it, too, was that the happy Chandlers came into play. The Chandlers did not, they were unhappy with the direction of the company under Dennis Fitzsimons. And so and Dennis went out to try the stock price had languished, revenues were down, and so to kind of get the stock price up, he created a stock buyback where he was going to buy back borrow a couple $2 billion and buy back the stock. And that really jeopardized a couple of trusts that the Chandlers had, and they were worried that it would make it very difficult for them to unwind these trusts in a way that wouldn't cause them to pay a lot of tax. So they wrote a letter to the board and made it public, attacking the management of the company, the direction of the company, and when you do that, the company goes up for sale. And so that's when the company was put up for sale.
Why was it that so many people trooped here from various places, Wall Street, a lot of other media companies, looked at the books and headed back to O'Hare as quickly as they did? Well,
at that time, the newspaper business, it was on, you had companies coming up for sale. Knight Ridder was forced into a situation where a a hedge fund guy forced it out to be put up for sale, and I think it was the Minneapolis Tribune, which had sold for $1.5 billion like 9 years before. They got about $500 million for it, and everybody was shocked that it wouldn't bring any more money than that. And people began doubting it. The internet was coming along. The newspaper industry really didn't know how to deal with the internet. And so stock prices started tumbling, and it was an uncertain future. Nobody wants to walk into an uncertain future. They don't want to take that risk. So they all looked at the books, couldn't figure out how to make it work and walked away.
Now, to me, the most fascinating stuff in the book involves the period of time where this guy you've got to tell us a little bit more about, named Sam Zell, comes into the picture, and there is this feverish activity behind the scenes to put together this deal. Tell us a little bit about his entry onto the scene and the feverish activity which you disclose, particularly as involves some well-known firms in this country, J.P. Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, all involved, and as you characterize it, seem to be doing same out of less than the most noble of interests, not necessarily caring much about things like social mission and a lot more about significant fees and expenses to be paid. And tell us also how that relates to something called a solvency letter, which you spend a lot of time on.
Well, when Sam Zell he's kind of nicknamed himself the grave dancer, and his big thing would be to come by, he wants to buy distressed assets. So he wants to come in when you're not doing well and pay a dime on the dollar to get a hold of your company, and then he can wring some expense out of it and reform it and then sell it off a few years later for a lot of money. He was successful in that in some cases, not always, but he was pretty successful at it. And he looked at the Tribune Company and he thought, okay, here's a company which I think he valued. He figured it was probably worth about $16 or $17 billion, and he could buy it for like 13. And all he had to do, particularly, was to borrow a lot of money to do it. So that's what he did. He put about $300 million down. Now, Sam Zell's worth billions and billions of dollars, and so $300 million is a lot to me, you, and anybody in this room. But it wasn't, relatively speaking, it wasn't that great of a risk for him. So he puts that down, probably laid off some of that on it, borrows the money, and goes out and he buys the Tribune, thinking that he's going to hold on to it for a while and make a killing.
But it wasn't just a matter of putting down $300 million, was it, and getting some loans. It was a very complicated deal, which was of great fascination to lots of people in the financial business. I remember the first and probably last time I will have gone skiing in my life. My wife took me out to Park City, Utah, following the deal, and we shared a house with some folks, including a CFO of a big Wall Street firm, who was far more obsessed with this deal than I was, because he just couldn't figure how it would work. He knew everything about it. He knew the involvement, you have to explain that, of an ESOP, so-called ESOP, and said that in his little world, if this deal worked, it was going to be something of historic consequence, but he just didn't get how it would work. So tell us about some of the intricacies of the deal itself. Well, and answer the question, were the rank-and-file workers shafted?
Okay. Well, actually, I'll do that first, because, the people who were working at the Tribune Company when the deal closed got $34 a share for the stock that they owned. So if you were sitting there and you had stock and you had purchased it and it was part of your compensation program over the years, you got $34 a share. There wasn't anybody else that was going to pay you $34 a share at that time. So some of these people didn't come off so badly, and they were saying, thank God Sam came along. But the way he structured it was unique. He created an ESOP, which is an employee stock ownership plan. And through a bunch of financial maneuvers, he used that to kind of buy the company and called it, he and the employees were kind of partners. And they were going to buy the company, and because it was an ESOP, it didn't have to pay taxes. So the Tribune Company at that time was paying $200–300 million a year in income taxes. Way that goes. He could eliminate the 401k things, because now, as you're an ESOP, you're an owner, and your return's going to be in the stock. So bang, there goes another $60–70 million. And he's looking at all of these expense savings, and it was unique. And a lot of people on Wall Street did not understand this. And when he went and sold it, he convinced them that this would work. But he constructed this elaborate kind of two-phase deal. And it's really complex about the way he did it. But the first phase, he bought 50% of the stock. And then he wasn't going to buy the next 50% until the end of the year. So it was in 2007, in May of 2007, they buy 50% of the stock, and it leaves you a 6-month period where the whole company's in limbo. And all of a sudden, people in Wall Street began taking a closer look because they're saying, can this guy actually close this deal? And they're looking at all the debt that's involved, and they're looking at what's happening to the revenues, and they began doubting that he can close the deal. So the stock that was out there, still out there, tanks. And everybody's trying to figure out if he's going to be able to pull this off. And he keeps saying, I can do it, I can do it. And he's got all the money borrowed. And the banks then begin saying, you know, the first phase of the deal, the investment banks earned $161 million in fees. Now, that was more than enough for me to run the LA Times newsroom for a year and employ 970 journalists. So that was a huge amount of money. And then but then the second phase is coming along, and they're going to get another $122 million in fees. So altogether, it's like $280 million in fees that they have riding at this deal, but the deal has to close. So there's this enormous momentum to close this deal, despite people saying, you know, I don't know if this thing's going to work. This could bankrupt the entire company. Now, if you're a banker, it's against the law to lend somebody money when you know that the loan will put them in bankruptcy. So the big deal became they had to go get a solvency opinion. And this is an outside, it's kind of a good housekeeping seal of approval from some financial guy who will say, this is going to be okay, they're going to make it. So they went to several firms that didn't want to touch it. And then they went to one in Milwaukee, a Valuation Research Corporation, and they paid him $1 million, which is a huge fee, to do a very quick solvency opinion on the second phase of the deal. They issued the solvency opinion even though most of the people that worked for Valuation Research Corporation were suggesting not to do it. They got that deal, and that's how the deal got closed. That's how the banks got their fee. That's how Sam Zell got the company, and that's how the employees got screwed, because they all ended up, you know, being in a company that they couldn't carry that debt, and that's when they began laying them off. So that when I think I was at the Chicago Tribune, we had a little over 700 journalists working in the newsroom. When I was at the LA Times, we had a little over 920 journalists working in the newsroom. Probably too many, but right now, I'd say I know the LA Times is down below, probably around 550 to 575 journalists. So all of those people lost their jobs. The Chicago Tribune, I don't know their levels, but I would suspect their staff is smaller by a third to a half by now. So everybody, all these, you know, it looked great. And we were all, frankly, when Sam Zell came along, we thought, maybe he's got the answer. I mean, you know, we've been trying. We can't figure it out. Sam Zell, big, successful guy. He comes along. Boy, you know, and he's saying to us, you can't cut your way out of this. I'm going, hey, man, let's hear that. I want to hear some more about that. You can't cut your way out of this. You got to grow revenue. And we're all out there struggling to do this. But in the end, the debt was just, you know, it was so narrow that if we missed our projections by like 2%, the ESOP would not get any kind of funding or any kind of benefits for 5 years. It was that close. And so the thing, just finally it went into bankruptcy at the end of the year, and now they're still struggling. And Frank, right now, these papers are far better off in bankruptcy court than they're going to be when they get out of bankruptcy court, because when they get out of bankruptcy court, they're going to be owned by banks, and the banks don't want to be in the newspaper business. They want their money back. And when they want their money back, there's one way they're going to get it back. They're going to cut. And so I think, you know, it's a pretty grim situation for the employees.
Is there any Jack Daniels around here that I was going to meet my wife later, but if anybody has a flask here, just send it right up after that cheery assessment. Jim, Zell can obviously be a pretty convenient foil, particularly given a sort of a larger-than-life personality, very profane guy. But to what extent should there be a fair amount of responsibility shared by the previous Tribune Company Board of Directors? What about their role, including some bastions of the Chicago community who undoubtedly thought that in some way they were upholding this very meritorious legacy?
I didn't drink enough wine to answer that one. But anyway, there's culpability and responsibility for the board. I mean, I think, you know, everybody was probably guilty of wanting the deal to go through. Everybody was guilty of hoping against hope that we could get out of this. And so I think people kind of closed a blind eye to some pretty disturbing reality. I think, you can't, the journalists, we all were wondering, boy, we wanted to be successful. We wanted this thing to work. So, I would imagine if we would have been reporting this deal, we would have gone, hey, man, this debt, are you crazy? This isn't going to make it. But we didn't. We turned a blind eye to it too. So I think there was a lot of responsibility all the way around. But, in the end, what I tried to do in the book was not assign blame, not point fingers, but just say, this is what happened, and let the reader figure that out.
Oh, come on. Let's not be so charitable here. Take us a little bit inside the Zell camp. And as I read the book, you suggest that there were two conflicting visions about what to do with this company and its assets within the Zell camp. And as you tell us about that, please do tell us about a fellow named Randy Michaels.
Well, in the Zell camp, there was one camp that said we should work with these existing editors. These are really solid, good editors. These are solid, good papers. We should really try to work with them and see what we can do to improve it. And that was kind of a memo that was drafted for Sam Zell by Bill Pate, his chief investment officer, talking about the first 100 days. What do we do when we got this company? The second memo was by Randy Michaels, who was his chosen COO, and it was totally different. It was, 12, 13 pages of bullet points, never mentioned the word journalism, and basically said, let's cut this crap about giving the people what they need to know. We got to get, this is an attention deficit society, attention deficit disorder society. We need to give them what they're going to read, and we need to get them what's going to sell ads, and that is the philosophy that prevailed. And Randy wanted to say, let's have fun. And his idea of fun was not much fun for a lot of other people, particularly women. He was a pretty abusive kind of guy in that regard, and it's well chronicled, some of the incidents that occurred. And so they went with Randy, and it was a disaster. And they, I think, dumbed down the paper, and I don't think the citizens of Chicago benefited. I think the citizens of Chicago spoke fairly clearly, because I think a lot of them have quit the paper and walked away from it.
There's a chapter in this book that's titled Count Kern. Explain that title and why you decided to write about that topic.
Well, because it a certain...
Who is Count Kern?
Count Kern is Jerry Kern. He had a position in Tribune Publishing, and it was, he decided that he and I were kind of competitors for a managing editor job at once, and I became the managing editor, and Jerry went upstairs, and I don't think he ever really got over not being named managing editor. But anyway, that point aside, he began really examining our operations, and there were some good reasons to do this, because you could eliminate some duplication, but I think he really focused on it, and he began counting how many people, if Hurricane Katrina occurred, how many people were we sending to cover this thing? How many people did the Chicago Tribune send? How many people did Newsday send? How many people? What did they write? And he began examining it in a very granular way, and it wasn't and I kind of began thinking of him as this guy that counts everything, because every time I turn around, I got Jerry out there counting how many people I'm doing and basically trying to kind of second guess why we did this. And I think in the end, that gave people some ammunition that they needed when Randy Michaels came along to basically really cut back the staff pretty severely. And they closed all of the foreign bureaus and the national bureaus of the Chicago Tribune, and basically determined that no one in the city of Chicago was interested in anything other than local news, and that they didn't really need their own foreign reports, and they didn't need their own national stories, and I totally disagree with that. And so I felt like it was an important part of the story that shed some light on why these guys would come along and just decimate the place like that, because that's what they were looking at.
Meanwhile, out in Los Angeles, you're the editor-in-chief of the Los Angeles Times. Your boss, the publisher, a man named David Hiller, is now the head of the McCormick Foundation here in Chicago. Explain your relationship to him and why ultimately you departed the LA Times.
Well, I think David, was he was a nice guy, and he was really trying to do the right thing out there. But we got into a big difference of opinion, not about cuts, but but if you're going to cut the budget, what do you do with the savings? And he was under pressure from Sam Zell to put those savings to the bottom line. I kept saying we need to reinvest that in the paper. I had started to try to convert the paper from a news organization that broke stories online and explained and analyzed them in the paper. And for that, we needed some selective investment. And no one was going to give me that investment. And I said, look, David, I've been cutting budgets for 5 years now. I know how to do it pretty well. This isn't working. We keep cutting the budget and things keep getting worse. We need to take this, and I had done a couple of things with a couple of sections that really generated some new revenue, and I wanted to go through the paper and begin examining each section and try and generate more revenue and try to deal with this problem with a balance of budget cuts and revenue enhancements. And he didn't want to go that way, so he decided that he was going to make a transition. And so David always said, he still says, I didn't fire you, and I said, well, I don't know, because I had never been fired before. But when somebody takes you to lunch and they say to you, I'm going to put somebody else in your job, I kind of think that qualifies. So we probably still disagree with that, but we just could not see eye to eye on the future. And I said, I told you when I came out here I wasn't going to just cut this place indiscriminately. And if that's what you want to do, or if you think, and he said, this place just needs to get smaller, smaller, and smaller. And I said, well, you probably need to get yourself an editor that would do that, because I won't do it. And so that's when he said, okay, I am going to get myself an editor that would do it, and he did.
Part of the book is personal and poignant, so let me ask you, what was it like, whether it was fired or quit, what was it like to be out wherever you were, condo, near the beach, and presumably for the first time in your adult life, unemployed?
Well, it was interesting, because in a way it was a little bit liberating. I'll never forget the first day, because I went and I sat and I'm looking at the ocean and the waves are coming in and I'm drinking a cup of coffee, and I thought, holy, I don't have anywhere to go today. And it was the first time since I was a kid that I hadn't had a job or somewhere that I had to go out and do something that day. And I thought, what am I going to do? And I thought, well, I'll go ride my bike. That'll be the first thing, kind of clear my head out. And then I began thinking, well, there's a lot of things I want to do. I've always wanted to do. I wanted to write a play. So I sat down and tried to write a play. I actually wrote a play. It wasn't very good. So, and then I decided I wanted to, I started to revive my interest in photography. I began thinking about, okay, there's a lot of things you want to do in your life, and now here's an opportunity to do them. You don't have to sit down anymore and, worry about how, and go into the office every day and think, how am I going to save these people's, what am I going to do to keep these people working? What am I going to do to avoid laying them off? So I looked at it in some senses as an opportunity. It was unsettling, though, because, you just get fired in a highly publicized incident. Everybody's writing that you're in your 60s, so there goes another job, pal. My daughter was still in school. My son was in graduate school, so I was trying to, it was a pretty scary thing. It really is, to sit down and look at it and say, but then you just look and say, well, I always look at bad situations and say, where's the opportunity? And so I saw an opportunity in being able to try to do some different things, go in a different direction. And I got basically bailed out by a guy named Alex Jones at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, who called me and said, would you like to come here and be a fellow? And I thought, I'd never been a fellow, so I always never really understood what a fellow did, and I thought, that sounds better than being a nobody, so I'll go be a fellow. I never dreamed in a million years that I could even get through the door at Harvard. I mean, like you said, I graduated the third lowest in my class. So here I went to Harvard, and I'm sitting in Kennedy School, and, I got a researcher, and I could tell her she was helping me research the book. I had a book contract by this time. And then along came this opportunity, and then I began, it's a funny thing happened to me at Harvard. All these kids started coming up to me. One kid, I took him to lunch. He was the editor of the Harvard Crimson. And he said to me, we had this lunch and we talked about all the things that I had done. And he said, at the end of the lunch, he said, I want to be you. And I said, what? He said, I want to do exactly what you did. And I said, are you crazy? I said, everybody I know is being laid off, they're fired, they're unemployed, and you want to be like me? And he says, yeah, but you went out and you really tried to change things, and you really tried to do some good things in the world, and that's what I want to do. And I began thinking about that, and I became friends with some of the people in the Neiman program. And I began looking, and they were all there, and here were mid-career journalists, talented people, some of the best in the business. And they were all worried that when they went back to their papers, they wouldn't have a job. And then I started thinking about it. I thought, the newspaper business was good to me. I was a kid from nowhere, and I got to edit 2 great newspapers, and maybe I should try to give something back. And so an opportunity came when my publisher, Peter Osnos, called me and said they were trying to form a new news organization in Chicago, and would I help? And so I did. I told him I'll be a catalyst. I will help you get this off the ground. I'll work for you for a year for no salary, but I don't want to run another news organization. And here I am, almost 2 years later. I'm the editor of the Chicago News Cooperative. We're out there, and it's a really kind of an R&D project trying to figure this out. Well, how are you going to finance and how are you going to pay for serious public service journalism, the kind that is really needed in any city, any county, anywhere? How are you going to do that? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure that out right now. And nobody has figured that out. No legacy news organization, no one. But I really feel strongly that it's important. And it's important to this community, and it's important to the country, and it's important to the world to have strong, edited information, not gossip, not junk, not stuff that's just put up somewhere so somebody can justify an ad stack. You really have to get out and figure it out, and that's what we're trying to do. And that really kind of led me to another point where I thought, I'm glad I got fired, because I would have never done this if I hadn't been fired. And I'm out there, and it's fun, and it's interesting. It's scary. Because, sometimes it's the same thing. You walk into a place, you figure, how are we going to get money to keep these people employed? And I've learned what many people in this audience probably have experienced, fundraising. Boy, does that suck. I mean, I don't like it. I'm a journalist. I never asked for anything. And there I am. I'm going out trying to raise money, and that's what I do now. I'm not really a journalist anymore. I'm a fundraiser, and I'm probably not very good at it, but I'm trying at it. But the whole thing is to try to figure out, how are we going to provide the money that does this vital service? Because nobody's going to buy an ad and say, hey, do you want to buy an ad and sponsor a story that, puts somebody in jail? No thanks. So you have to kind of figure out, okay, how are we going to do this? Because the kind of journalism that's really going is the coverage of government and institutions in the State House and all of these things where a lot of our problems are rooted. And so that's what we're trying to do. So in the long-winded answer to your question, I'm probably, what it was like. It was scary at first, but in the end, it was a pretty enlightening and thrilling thing. And I got an opportunity to try something and maybe help people and teach kids journalism and the kind of journalism I believe in.
I'm going to ask, I have a whole bunch more questions, but I'm going to ditch all of them so you guys can ask a few questions. And when we do, there's a mic from C-SPAN, so if you can just hold off a second before it comes. We just mentioned in passing a thing called the Internet, and I see a friend, Howard Tullman, a great Chicago entrepreneur who had something called Flashpoint Academy, which is kind of multimedia vocational school, and I saw him give a speech a couple of weeks ago which sort of laid out how people were consuming media these days. And it's both frightening and challenging, and you see the amount of folks who get their news every day, from YouTube, for example, and the dramatic accelerating changes. Say you took over some big media company today, how do you deal with monetizing what you're doing, particularly online, in a way that can pay for that great journalism of which you were a part of?
Well, I think part of one of the things that we were talking about doing is trying to create communities of interest, organized around a subject. I mean, I don't think you can look anymore at a mass audience. That's not going to be there. So you look for, let's find the people in Chicago that are intensely interested in education. And let's create a news interest network kind of online that really gets into good education coverage. And can you find 10, 20,000 people, less than 1/2% of the population of Cook County? Can you find people like that would pay $2 a week for good education coverage? And then you use that money to hire education reporters, go out and cover the subject, and then they create just the real good, solid, good education coverage online, and then you create another, and out of that you kind of cherry pick through that and create a broader site for people that don't want to pay for it. So can you go out and can you find people that are interested in politics? Can you find people in education, health, all of these subjects, and create these narrower audiences that will pay for this because they care about it and they're committed to it, and there are people out there like that. And can you use that money to hire about 40, 50 reporters to go out and cover the city and get that kind of coverage that is sorely needed? And can you use that to create a broader, I mean, the way we do it, we did one little experiment with a thing called Early and Often. It was a political website, and we got people to pay for it. It was very granular political information, and we took some of that information and we created something called the Palm Card, which is something that everybody gets for free. So we're getting money from certain people that are really interested in politics, and we're using that money to do two things: hire political reporters, and then support a website that sends it out to the general public so that people, and that's kind of our idea of CNC. But I mean, I think in a legacy news organization, you got to do two things. The first thing you got to start doing is gradually get out of the printing business. It's too expensive, and people are not going to pay you $5 for a newspaper every day, or 10, or 3 or 4, and that's about what it takes, because that's the big cost. It's not the reporter. It's the printing press, it's the ink, it's the drivers, it's the paper. That's what costs you all the money. That's 70 to 80% of your budget. And so you got to get out of that business because it's uneconomic at the prices that people are used to getting a newspaper. So you got to go online. So maybe you don't have a daily newspaper. Maybe you have a newspaper 3 days a week. Maybe you have it 1 day a week. Maybe you have a weekend magazine, and every other day you got an online business. And I think, then your costs go way down because you're no longer delivering these things everybody to every day, and sometimes they aren't even looking at them. So I think you got to take, and then I think you also have to go on the business side of it and quit selling zip codes and ad positions and start selling people. Well, who do you want to reach? We've got the data. How are you going to get them there? How do you get people on Facebook? What do you do with Twitter? How do you reach your audience? How do you really? That's what we have to become. Newspapers have to become modern information companies that deal in traffic and information and help people that are business, that are wherever, get their message across to the people in the audience, because we do know the audience, and we have to figure that out. I don't know if that's the answer, but it's a hell of a lot better than sitting here and watching everything go to hell in a handbasket.
My last question is about methodology in writing the book, and partly is inspired by a couple of weeks ago, and I think a first box of books showed up, and you gave me a copy, and I said, thanks a million, and 2 feet outside your door, I instantly looked at the index, and as vain as I am, breathed a sigh of relief. That was only mentioned once. Competent Washington bureau chief, something like that, which was fine by me. There are a lot of other people who are mentioned many, many more times. There are a lot of people whom we spend a lot of time with, particularly corporate executives. And some of those aren't treated quite as benignly as I am. tell me a little bit about that, about both, I don't know if you call it an ethical matter, but how you used information that originally came to you in distinctly private business meetings with some of those folks, and then just talk to me just a little bit about, I don't know what you call it, the more emotional side of it. I mean, I cringed at occasional sentence here and there about some of the folks we know. Since we're only talking to, a few people here and a few million on TV maybe, the former CEO of the company, who we spent a lot of time with, you particularly, named John Madigan, and he's not going to necessarily be a happy camper. Tell us about the challenge of writing about people whom you knew in a pretty intimate way.
Well, I could say, I'll respond to John. I don't care what I was going to write. I knew at the end John would be mad at me. I pretty well took that as a given, because John, I don't think, is going to he doesn't like the idea of me writing about this. But, I mean, I kind of went back to almost everybody and in interviews went over a lot of what happened, so that it wasn't, there are some instances of maybe a private meeting that I was directly involved in that I used. But I didn't do it unless I thought it really lent to the story. It contributed to the narrative. It characterized something. There were things that I struggled with, frankly. There are a couple of incidents that are pretty embarrassing to people that I went back and forth. At one point I'd be in, then I'd say, no, I'm going to take it out. And then I'd go back and be in. And I just had to sit down and say, does this specific thing, does it contribute, does it lend understanding to what happened? And if it did, I used it. And it's hard, because I don't want to embarrass people. I really don't, but I think you have to look at, I'm a journalist. And in the end, any journalist is the same way. When you sit down to write, your only friend in the world is that reader that's in front of you. And it's, you look at it and it's a screen, but it's a reader. And you got to be loyal and faithful to the story. And so that was my guiding criteria, is if it lent some understanding, insight, or context to the story, that's when I would consider using it. If not, there were a lot of other stuff that frankly I didn't use, that I found in my reporting that would have been much more embarrassing to people. So I didn't. But that was meant to. And
one of those acts that offers a great deal of insight and context does involve oral sex. So when you go to Amazon tonight, there's a little bit of titillation in there, which is, in its own way, very, very, very revealing. And with that, like People magazine-like segue, please, let's open up to a few questions. What was he talking about? Oral sex? Huh?
Jim, you and I know each other, so you know I'm not looking for a job. I'm gainfully employed. For how much longer, I'm not sure. But here's my question. Fossils like me have always taken a great deal of comfort in the integrity of the news gathering aspects of what you've done for a living, and has brought so much integrity to the publications that you've been involved with. That model is vanishing. I love telling everyone, as you and I talked about tonight, that I've got daughters 21 and 24, and I don't think they've ever read a newspaper. And of course, you folks in journalism have all seen that and are trying to make the transition into the digital media. You're doing that at the same time that there's so much pressure, economic pressure, on the traditional news gathering model that you just can't gather news. Integrity that you brought to the news process when we read the digital media, when really it's gathered from places like Perez Hilton, PNC, YouTube. Maybe they have a great deal of credibility. They don't. Some of them, I don't know what they are. But what do you think?
Well, I think that it's going to be, in the future, there will be good journalism. I guess my concern about it is I think you'll have really good journalism and high standards for people who are able to pay $2 a day for the New York Times, or $6 a Sunday, or $18,000 to $20,000 a year for a Bloomberg machine, which has an army of journalists, and they're very, very good. But for the rest of the people, there won't be that kind of journalism. That's what really scares me, because I think that's a fundamental change in our society. One of the beauties of a newspaper is it delivered to your doorstep every day the same information, rich or poor, for less than the price of a cup of coffee. And that was an amazing thing. And that's not going to be this true in the future, because it's a model that's broken and it won't. So I mean, I think that's why I kind of got involved in the CNC, is to say, okay, we got to figure it out, because if we don't figure it out, it will go away. And I think the best thing, I do see lots of hope. I see lots of these organizations springing up, and I'm just hoping that the traditional newspaper organizations can learn from us, and we can learn from them about how we can maintain that.
Another question, I think up in the front here.
Hi. You had commented that while you were still at the LA Times, you had started to think about the online aspects of things as being a source of breaking news, and that you were going to use the newspaper as an extended analysis of the story. Do I need to repeat that?
No, just go on. I'll repeat.
All right.
I will.
Okay, and so can you expand on that and tell me what your thought process was and what you hope to accomplish with that?
The question is sort of what was Jim's theoretical strategy when he was running the LA Times about how to divide the role of the internet, the online version of the LA Times, with the print version? Did he see them as two separate entities?
Well, I think at that time, you know, there was a divide in newsrooms. There was an online newsroom and there was a print newsroom. And what you had to really try to do, and it was very, very difficult because it was a culture clash, like all these culture clashes, and you really had to make people realize that you really have to, this is one news organization, and each medium has its own strength. And journalists like to tell stories, and so if you could kind of convince people that the important thing here was, you know, tell your story for the medium that it's in. And then, so I think my thought of it was I kind of explained to people, I laid out for them, here's what's happening in classified automobile advertising. And this is what was paying your salary. And we lost, say, $200,000 in print advertising last year, and we only gained $50,000 in online. And if we don't get the online going, then next year it's going to get worse, and I'm going to have to lay a bunch of you off. So let's get with the program. And that was a pretty successful message out there. And people began taking it to heart and looking at it. And it's just, you know, and that actually started, and it's still going on. And I think the LA Times has been pretty successful with its online operation because they kind of adopted that. But it's a very, very difficult proposition for a lot of journalists at that time. A lot of print journalists were very resistant to having their stories appear online before they appeared in the paper. And it was a real hard to break that down. And there are a lot of people in this room that wrestled with that, and they can tell you it's tough. But we had to do it.
Can you talk about classified ventures in terms of, I think you said the Trib was early to the online internet world. Is that what you were referring to?
I was referring...
The question is about a Tribune company entity called Classified Ventures, which was pretty early to this online world.
Yeah. Well, I think the one that I was referring to was a different one. It was called Career Builder. And Career Builder was really an outgrowth of a jobs section in the newspaper. And we basically took Career Builder, made it an online jobs and information and classified advertising vehicle. And when we did it, Monster had overtaken all newspapers and was way up there, and everybody thought, that's it, it's all over. And through a lot of hard work by people, and I think actually Jack Fuller was one of the driving forces behind it, Career Builder eventually overtook Monster, and is one of the few examples of a legacy news organization creating an internet vehicle that became a very powerful force in the industry. So, I mean, I think it was So that's what I was referring to, and then that saved some of the classified advertising. But Craigslist was coming along with free classifieds, which killed us.
Right back.
Jim, in your book, you talk about the greatness of the editorial voices of the Tribune and the LA Times when they were at their peaks. What's the future of an editorial voice in a model like the Chicago News Cooperative?
I'm sorry, I don't really understand. Could you be a little more?
The influence of Otis Chandler, the influence of Colonel McCormick to set the tone from the publisher's perspective.
Okay, and how would we do that at the Chicago News Co? Well, I mean, I think it's your values. I mean, if you embrace the values of a journalist, and I think part of it, one of the reasons that the people you mentioned, Otis Chandler and McCormick, and the people who really made the Tribune a great newspaper, is that they had really strong journalistic values, and they really believed in the journalism. And I think it's, we kind of got out of fashion that journalists should be in charge of the business side of the operations and be involved in it. We had a wall to protect us so we would be made pure and would never do that. I think that's got to change. And I think journalists have to assume some of the business responsibilities that we didn't do for a long, long time and kind of figure this out. Because of I think what Mike Cole said, what I was talking about before, that every news organization, it has to be based on the public's respect for you and for your values and for the institutions you run. So you have to really be strong, and you really have to resist. And I think it'll be easier in an organization like the Chicago News Cooperative that is trying to figure out, can I balance a bunch of revenue streams so I'm not so beholden to somebody that it gives a bad appearance. So I think a lot of it is in the value of a journalist and the value of what you're really driving for. And what you're driving for is a respect of the public. And if you have the respect of the public and readers, you can always figure out some way to monetize that.
If we have one or two more, why don't we just take those and then call it a night?
Jim or Jims, do you foresee a model or a future where people are going to pay for online content of any quality?
Question is, does either of us see a future in which folks will pay for high-quality information online?
Well, I think you're seeing that. I mean, you see that in Bloomberg. They pay a lot of money for high-quality information. I think as the newspapers shrink and as it becomes much more difficult for them to keep providing this information for free, you're seeing it now, more and more papers. In the smaller papers throughout the country, they're all charging for online content, and they're doing it pretty well at it. It's the bigger metro dailies that really aren't doing that yet, and I think they have to, because you cannot. This is unsustainable. You cannot give away information, pay a bunch of journalists to gather information and give it away for free, and expect to make it up in an ad market that's going like that. It isn't going to happen.
Maybe one last one. If we got an esteemed former Chicago Tribune correspondent, Dorothy Collin.
Jim, I'm just going to ask you something other people, critics, will ask you, and that is, they will claim that you were trying to settle scores. What is your answer to that?
The question from Dorothy is, you're going to be hammered for settling scores.
Well, I think, you kind of accept that that's going to happen to you when you write a book like this. I gave the book to several people ahead of time and said, do I look like I'm settling scores? Tell me the truth. If you do, tell me. And I changed a lot of things where people said, you're being a little mean there, and the turn of the phrase looks a little like a dagger, and so I kind of eliminated a lot of that, and I just tried not to. I really did try to say, if I were reporting the story as a reporter, even though I'm involved in it, could I just do an honest job of saying what happened? That's really what I wanted to do, is this is what happened. Now, there are going to be people, and I say up front, this is from the bias of a journalist that worked in the trenches. This is not, so I tried to be pretty upfront about it. But, you're going to get all that. And so, I've taken a lot of lumps in my day. I can take a few more.
Well, I want to just wrap up by, first of all, thanking everybody for showing up here tonight, thanking Leslie Hindman for offering this space, thank the folks at C-SPAN, and I'm one of the ones, Dorothy, who was a little bit nervous in picking this up and thinking it was going to be just a whole lot of score settling, as much of it as I kind of would have liked to have seen on one level. But when I put the last page down, I sent Jim an email saying, you got more self-restraint than I would have had. And I think at the core of it is a book less about personalities than about some very, very, very significant societal and cultural shifts, all seen through the prism of a very important American institution that just happens to have been based here in Chicago for a long, long time, and was central to the workings in many ways of democracy in a major American city. And I think that link ultimately between what Jim is talking about and our role as citizens in a democracy is very significant, and you can read it and either find things to be hopeful about, or as I wanted to earlier, see if there's a flask of Jack Daniels around. But I think it's a good, serious, important work, and Jim, you're to be congratulated, and thanks for spending time with us.
Okay, thank you.
For more on this book and author James O'Shea, visit thedealfromhell.com.